Let's talk more about that story. Bring in international relations expert Brooks Spector. Brooks, a very good evening to you. So Guterres making it clear at the Doha Forum today that he's not giving up hope on the success or for the success of diplomatic efforts to reach a humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza. The question now is, how does that hope turn into reality for Palestinian civilians?
Well, good evening and good to be with you. Let's go to the argument that was made by the U.S. representative in the Security Council that explained their vote. Now, let's keep in mind, of course, that I don't work for the U.S. government and haven't for 2 decades. So I'm reading this information and trying to interpret it as best I can. The basic argument seems to be that the resolution as proposed was unbalanced in that it did not condemn Hamas's initial terror attack on October 7th. It did not make any mention of the gender-based violence that was visited upon women who were attacked, if not killed. And it did not do, among other things, reaffirm Israel's right to exist as a nation, as a de jure member of the UN and the family of nations, nor did it accept and mention Israel's right to defend itself. What it also did, in the explanation from the U.S. government representative, said that they would have hoped that there would have been further humanitarian pauses which would have allowed further exchanges of hostages and an international commission of the Red Cross to be able to have access and provide medical help to all of the hostages still held by Hamas in Gaza. And as a result, they felt obligated to veto the resolution. And I do want to underscore that point about humanitarian pauses. There had been one that was extended by, 4 days? Right. And it was entirely possible that there could have been another one or an extension of the previous one or a resumption of it. And as a result, those collectively were the reasons for the veto.
And there has been condemnation, at least from the United Nations itself, including directly from the Secretary-General of Hamas's attacks on Israel, where 1,200 people were killed and more than 200 hostages were taken. Many of the individual countries have also condemned that action, right? The conversation now is about whether 17,000 dead Palestinians later, is there still enough time to be going back and forth about the language of the resolution when many more civilians are still dying in Gaza? Because Hamas has rightfully been condemned.
Well, there's always time to have further exchanges. There's no reason why another resolution could not be introduced today or tomorrow morning, for example, that took into consideration any or all of the points that I just listed. The likelihood of that, I suspect, though, is fairly low. Given the way things have been going, and in fact, given the range of casualties, I think it's important. My reaction, my feeling is that this is the time to begin to press both Israel and Hamas to engage in a way which brings an end to violence, at least through the humanitarian pauses, which would also allow supervised and managed transshipments of relief supplies. I mean, it is obviously a desperate situation, and desperate situations call for quick and thorough measures. And I think that part of the problem was there was an awful lot of weight put on the words ceasefire, but not enough thought on what constitutes the guts, the interstices of what a ceasefire would entail. And that's unfortunate in my view.
Interesting, of course, that the Americans still insist within the United Nations framework that they want language that ultimately would sit well with the Israelis in particular, where they want condemnation of Hamas and much of what's unfolded since October 7th to be focused on what Hamas did on that morning in Israel. Yet, when you hear the likes of Antony Blinken and President Biden speak, there appears to be an impatience, if you will, or really an urgency that they are feeling for the bloodshed in Gaza to come to an end. Is there anything that they can do outside of the UN structures to make sure that the violence wraps up at this point? Because Israel has not achieved the objective to wipe out Hamas. People are still moving further into other parts of Gaza where they were told these would be safe zones, but those don't appear to be safe zones. And desperate families in Israel are still waiting for the return of their loved ones who are held in some of these areas, reportedly, or it's believed, where the bombs are falling down.
Well, I mean, there obviously is going to be pressure, not public pressure perhaps, but pressure between governments, between the Americans and the Israelis, in terms of the way in which the Israelis continue their attacks, what it is they attack. And it is entirely possible to me that at some point the Israelis simply say, we have achieved one of our basic objectives, which is to render Hamas an ineffective fighting force. Let's move on with the hostages and the exchanges of prisoners. I mean, things like that do happen in international conflicts. Somebody declares a victory and then you move on. What has to happen now, I think, is for the Israelis to find that whatever it is that they are doing now is not necessarily getting them any closer to what I usually refer to as Chapter 2 or Act 3. Once they have carried out all these attacks and once, much of the infrastructure has been damaged or destroyed, and as further casualties take place, the question the Israelis are going to have to ask, in which they probably do not yet have a good answer, unfortunately, is, okay, now what happens? Who governs Gaza? Who is in charge? Who manages reconstruction? Who manages to help the afflicted and the wounded and the injured? And how does, and how do people get once again the ability to move back to where their houses might have been? And as far as I can tell, at least, the Israelis have not managed to think through all the way to the end point of this process. And that's, I think, doubly unfortunate. Hamas, on the other hand, wanted to provoke an attack and then a crisis and then retribution. They've succeeded at that, but look at the terrible cost that has come out of that. And so we've reached the point where in some way, shape, or form, there is going to be some chivying of forces to say, okay, enough. But I can't point you to a specific event or a time frame or a schedule when that would happen. I wish I could.
And Antonio Guterres, speaking today at the Doha Forum once more, said that what's basically happened with this war is it's undermined the credibility of the Security Council. What credibility does it have left, given its failure to be effective, shall we say, in the resolution of multiple conflicts around the world currently? Because what we've seen happen time and time and again is that especially those with a veto power decide not on what is perhaps morally or ethically or even legally just, but more on where their alliances lie at a particular moment.
Well, I mean, let's be clear about this. The veto power and the Security Council, its 5 permanent members, and then a clutch of time-limited members without veto power goes right back to the beginning of the UN Charter in 1945, at a time when it was seen that the Allies in World War II would act cogently and cooperatively together. And for the first 25 years, the vetoes were largely carried out by the then Soviet Union. times have changed, and more there have been vetoes by the United States as the international arrangements have changed. What that does say, I think, in partial answer to your question, is that the Security Council doesn't have much effective power unless all of its permanent members, the United States, France, Great Britain, China, and now Russia, can agree on a measure to go forward. And that obviously limits its ability to carry out actions. It doesn't prevent them, but it does limit those events in which it can take action. There are a number of times when there is no veto, but a Security Council resolution does not necessarily lead to action if for no other reason that the United Nations doesn't have an army.
Right.
The United Nations has to rely on the contributions, support, and financial assistance of its members.
It makes it all feel like a great big waste of time, though, doesn't it? Especially when there are lives at risk.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that.
I was saying it makes it feel like a great big waste of time what happens within the Security Council when you consider that it can vote and even take a position, but cannot force any real action.
Well, I'm going to wax philosophical here for a minute and simply say, remember, the United Nations is not a world government. It's an association of now 194 sovereign nations, and as a result, it only can move forward when it can muster support from among its members. It's not quite like a family where the elders get to tell you this is how it's going to be done and everybody obediently snaps into place. It requires discussion, it requires debate, it requires backroom handshakes and deals, and it requires ultimately agreement that it is better to do something than to do nothing. And I think, we have to accept the fact that in some cases it's been very successful, and in other cases it has not been so.
Brooke Spector, always good to speak to you. Thank you so much for your time.